Our project is on culture, and more specifically, linguistic globalization and the effects that globalization has had on language. This project is put together by Malory Morgan, Lisa Childs, Justin Humber, Megan Schultz, and Spencer Pulliam. Our thesis is as cultures and societies combine, languages learned and used are translated, and certain meaning can be lost. The use of verbal communication, nonverbal communication, and intonation play into the understanding of a language. The positive and negative effects of globalization on language include new ways of teaching and spreading languages and cultures, while also leading to the extinction of others. We're going to start off by talking about what is language. On the most basic level, language can be defined as a method of human communication, either spoken or written, consisting of the use of words in a structured and conventional way. In other words, language is how we communicate with others and get our point across to the rest of the world. Language is thought to have gotten its start with early hominids and continued to change as primate language systems continued to get more and more complex. The continuing development of language is also thought to have progressed as brain volume increased. On a deeper level, language is how we express ourselves as individuals and as members of a community. Language not only conveys who we are, but it is a great way to express and convey culture to others. Language can help groups express feelings of togetherness and can strengthen bonds, both personally and culturally. Culture ties us together. Language shapes culture, and culture defines language. If culture was a house, then language was the key to the front door, to all the rooms inside. A big aspect of culture in certain area is the way they communicate, and the slang or jargon they use. If you have ever experienced going to a new place and not understood the slang they were using, you might have felt like an outsider. On the other hand, if you've ever been in a group of people who speak the same as you, it makes you closer to that person, even if you might not know anything about them personally. A big part of language has to do with nonverbal communication as well. Approximately 7% of any message is conveyed through the words we use. 38% is through certain vocal elements, including tone and pitch, and 55% communicated nonverbally through things like facial expressions, gestures, and posture. While certain gestures in the modern world are considered appropriate or complementary, that is not the way throughout much of the rest of the world. For example, Westerners utilize several gestures that they assume have universal meaning across cultures, like giving a thumbs up, a shoulder shrug, the peace sign, and others. These gestures permeate every aspect of our society, and with a general understanding of their meaning. In fact, these examples of verbal communication have even penetrated our digital communication. Often, there are cultural differences in nonverbal gestures and hand movements or other body positioning. For example, Westerners can look at the bottom of their feet. In the Middle East, it is considered insulting to show someone the sole of our feet, as the feet are considered unclean. While this seemingly innocent body position has no meaning in Western culture, it takes on a distinct cultural meaning when in Middle Eastern Islamic cultures. This gesture is not all-inclusive and can be used as an insult. An example of this would be the famous shoe-throwing incident in 2008, where an Iraqi journalist threw his shoe at President Bush. With nonverbal communication making up 55% of the message conveyed, it is increasingly important in a globalized world to avoid miscommunication. As we interact more on a global scale, we may be inclined to only focus on verbal language barriers. This can lead to miscommunication and misinterpreted messages without our global partners. In the Middle East, it is common to have much smaller expected interpersonal distance. The English value space very highly. Arabs, on the other hand, view space quite differently. In crowded shops, theaters, or train stations, the typical Englishman queues up instinctively. An Arab, on the other hand, may tolerate very close quarters when around others. The British may perceive this Arabic response to lines and space as uncivil. Through education and cultural understanding, we can operate within the globalized environment with a deeper understanding of surroundings and global partners. Another important factor in communication is understanding high context cultures versus low context cultures, and which we'll talk about next. There is an example of an American consultant team who pitched a project to a potential Japanese client. Typically, this team was used to working with other Americans who'd bombard the team with questions during and after the proposal. In the case of the Japanese client, there was a very long silence after the proposal. Taking this to mean disinterest, the team was ready to pack up and leave. However, the lead consultant of the team gestured them to stop. While observing the client, he was able to recognize something his team did not catch. In this case, understanding your audience and paying attention to indicators of nonverbal cues such as posture, facial expression, and body language are critical. When it comes to cross-cultural interactions, having a basic understanding of high context versus low context cultures could help you effectively convey your information to the other person, establish trust, and build better relationships both in the workplace and personal life. So what does it mean for a culture to be high context or low context? When it comes to culture in different parts of the world, there are certain tendencies and patterns for how people communicate. A basic awareness of these tendencies will help you determine your approach so your information can be received in the way you intend. In high context cultures, tradition is highly valued. Interpersonal relationships take time to build, since trust is important. If disagreement arises, whether in business or personal, it's often taken personally because relationships and team camaraderie are a priority. Communication is less about the words themselves and tends to be nonverbal and passive, leading to more of a visually expressive style of communication through facial expression and body language. A person's identity is centered around the group, and tasks are accomplished based on relationship of the people involved. People tend to be comfortable in close proximity to one another, and things tend to move at a slower pace, since time is not something that should be confined to a schedule. Low context cultures are individualistic and gravitate towards change. In the workplace, business is competitive, and the focus is more about individual achievement and advancement. Relationships tend to form and end quickly, and communication and decision-making is more about information and rationale. Therefore, words are key to getting your information across in a direct manner. A person's identity is rooted in one's own accomplishments. People generally choose privacy over proximity with others, and interactions tend to be more compartmentalized. Things tend to move at a faster pace, and having a prompt, predictable schedule is important. In the case of the American consultant who was observing their potential Japanese client earlier, the consultant noticed the posture and facial expressions of the client revealed deep thought and interest. By the time he spoke, it was time to give the Americans his business. As globalization continues to open opportunities to intermix relations between high and low context cultures, having a basic understanding of how to identify certain cues can help you adapt your method of getting your information across. Keeping things simple and pay attention to your audience, their persona, and even the environment setting. When in doubt, politeness, empathy, and patience will help weed through your differences and allow for effective communication. We will talk next about how globalization has affected the way in which we teach language with. Since globalization has led to the combining of different peoples and cultures, communication is more important than ever. We live in a world where technology facilitated by the internet, such as electronic chat rooms, video conferencing, and social networks, makes communication between these globalized audiences easy and more efficient than ever before. With this technological change and advancement, however, have also come problems. One of these, as Claire Cramsch describes, is a tension between what is taught in language learning classrooms and what students will need when they enter the real world. She goes on to interpret this tension as one between the modern world as we have known it and the world of late modernity, ushered in by today's economic interdependence, large-scale migrations, global information technologies, and global media known under the name of globalization. Globalization has brought about the notion of global languages and infringed on the idea of nation states, where language and culture are one. The bridge between language and culture rests uneasily on this tension. Like other problems that have followed globalization, there is not a definitive solution to figuring out how to ease this. Peter Neff and John Rakinski stated that, in addition to memorizing vocabulary and grammar, anyone becoming proficient in a foreign language must know the socio-cultural rules native speakers use when they communicate with one another. Not knowing the cultural components of language is problematic. These two teach English to entry-level college students in Japan and suggest using simple activities such as restaurant role play, international city poster presentations, and intercultural interview discussions to try and teach culture along with language to students. Another example of teaching language and culture comes from the University of Texas. They separate the language learning into different aspects and focus on each aspect individually. They focus on speaking, writing, listening, reading, vocabulary, grammar, pragmatics, and culture. They consider of all these essential skills in speaking a foreign language and focus on each of them equally. By addressing them individually, they try to ensure that each aspect is given proper attention and nothing is left out or underemphasized on. While there are many styles and methods used to teach these languages today, most of them follow the 5 C's laid out in standards for foreign language learning. They include communication, cultures, connections, comparison, and communities. It is easy to learn a language and leave some of these C's out, especially culture and communities, so the learner has somewhat of an obligation, as well as the teacher, to make sure that they understand the many complex layers that are expected to be addressed when communicating in a culture that is not your own. Franz Fanon was correct when he said, "To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture." In the remaining slides, we're going to cover the domination of certain languages and whether it leads to a loss of culture. In a world of ever-changing borders, cultural boundaries have expanded and contracted to meet the needs of citizens whose way of life merged by the cultural collision that naturally coincides when communities fuse. It is from these collisions that languages can become dominant, extinct, or combined to form something new. The words that have been borrowed cross-lingually are called internationalisms. In this era of global communication, they have started to be called globalisms. When communities live side by side, exchanging ideas and cultural behaviors, language and the meaning of words ends up being borrowed and can form something completely new, like English, for example. English, compared to many languages in the world, is considered young, only appearing less than 1,500 years ago. Britain is where people from many different places with many different languages invaded and settled, and these various languages affected the development of English. Latin, French, Italian, and German are some of the most common sources of English vocabulary. Trade or colonization added language such as Chinese, Hindi, and Arabic, though some of these loan words pronunciations have changed over time to fit with English pronunciations. Now, however, English is the predominant donor of vocabulary and set expressions in the process of linguistic globalization. Because American culture and events directly associated with America are discussed, monitored, and valued, worldwide English culture-specific vocabulary, or loan words and expressions or loan translations have been adopted throughout the world via a process called linguistic borrowing. Loan words are copies of the English source word, resemble the English word closely phonetically, and are often borrowed from universal fields like technology, business, economy, and politics, but also from American culture, so expressions such as rat race, first lady, fat-free, middle class, and positive thinking, and words like okay, internet, and hamburger can be heard around the world. It can be fun to track these words and phrases when you are the loner, but when you are the borrower, it can seem like you've relinquished your own way of saying things. Linguistic homogenization is a big fear for many worldwide. As discussed throughout the presentation, language also conveys culture through its refrains or sayings. For example, a Spanish dinner table saying oveja que bala perde bocado, or a sheep that bleats loses its mouthful of food, underlines the importance of cuisine in Spanish culture. What if English's increasing predominance in the younger generation crowds out such unique sayings, these seemingly innocuous but revealing windows into culture? Linguistic homogenization via the spread of English through technology-based loanwords and American culture is something that many countries have attempted to protect themselves against. Many countries have gone through periods of linguistic nationalism, and it is not hard to see why governments would want to protect their languages, but many linguists think that staunch anti-English approach is counterproductive, as the very process of economic globalization is moving toward detaching from Englishization and is adopting a multilingual plan, following the strategy that adapting to local customs and languages is necessary for product penetration, as people are likely to buy something when it is in their own language. An argument in favor of Englishization is the spread of English is practical to satiate the need of global communication, and English just happened to be the very language of choice purely because of the value and how many people already speak it. There are languages that are disappearing and being replaced by languages other than English. Cultures shift, languages change, and there are a lot of things other than force that make people give up their language and start speaking somebody else's. Loanwords do alter a language's character, but it might not be a bad thing. As discussed earlier, English owes much to the languages that came before it. Languages, like empires, also rise and fall. It's a natural cycle of history, and we will always mourn the deaths of those that fall while celebrating the birth of new tongues. In conclusion, we've covered different topics that range from defining language and how it's expressed, the linguistic differences in cultures, high context versus low context cultures, how language is taught and used within culture, and whether or not we should have a dominant language such as English, and whether it leads to a loss of culture. We appreciate your time.